Two airplanes are about to enter the same airspace, and nobody is listening to the person trying to stop it. Marcus Carter's voice was steady, but the urgency behind his words cut through the quiet hum of the Denver Air Route Traffic Control Center. The room was filled with the familiar sounds of aviation, keyboards tapping, radios crackling, and the low mechanical rhythm of a place where every second mattered. Outside, the Colorado morning stretched across the sky above Aurora, with thousands of feet of open air carrying hundreds of lives. Inside the control room, a single radar screen held everyone's attention. Marcus stared at the glowing lines moving across the display, his eyes following patterns most people would never notice. At 29 years old, he had learned that the sky did not care about titles, appearances, or assumptions. It only responded to accuracy. Flight 728. Adjust heading 270 immediately, Marcus said into his headset. His fingers moved quickly across the console. Flight 442. Descend to 1 to 4,000 feet. Confirm. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the radio came alive with routine responses from pilots following instructions. But Marcus saw something that did not feel routine. Two aircraft were approaching the same corridor at a distance that was shrinking faster than expected. He checked the information again. Then, once more. The numbers did not change. His heartbeat remained calm, but his focus sharpened. Across the room, Richard Hayes noticed Marcus standing away from his station. The 4-year-old operations manager had spent 3 decades in air traffic control. His reputation was built on confidence, discipline, and the belief that experience was the strongest guide in any situation. He walked toward Marcus with a serious expression. "What's going on?" Richard asked. Marcus turned slightly. "I believe these two flights are moving toward a conflict point." Richard looked at the screen, then back at him. "You believe?" The question carried more weight than the words themselves. Marcus understood that tone. He had heard it before, not only in this building but throughout his career. The quiet doubt that followed him into rooms where people decided whether he belonged. "I've reviewed the data twice," Marcus replied. "The separation is decreasing." Richard folded his arms. "Marcus, we don't change flight paths because someone gets nervous looking at a screen." A few nearby controllers glanced over, sensing the tension. Marcus kept his eyes on the radar. "Sir, this is not about being nervous. This is about preventing a mistake before it happens." Richard stepped closer. "You've been controlling airspace for 4 years. I've been doing this since before some of the people in this room started their careers." The words settled heavily around them. Marcus did not argue. He knew respect could not be demanded, and he knew anger would only make people stop listening. Instead, he pointed toward the display. "Experience matters. That's exactly why we should pay attention when something doesn't look right." Richard looked at the screen again, but his expression remained unchanged. Around them, the control center continued moving. Flights were arriving, flights were departing. Every person had a role, and every decision carried responsibility. Marcus took a slow breath and adjusted his headset. "I'm requesting immediate confirmation from both aircraft." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Marcus, are you sure you want to escalate this?" Marcus looked at the radar one more time. The blue and green signals continued moving closer together. "Yes, sir," he answered quietly. "Because if I'm wrong, we can explain why we acted early. But if I'm right, we may not get another chance." For a brief moment, nobody spoke. The glow from the radar reflected across Marcus's face as the entire room waited for the next response from the sky. Marcus Carter had learned one important lesson during his years inside the control room. The hardest part of the job was not reading the sky. It was convincing people to believe what the sky was already showing. The radar continued glowing in front of him, each movement carrying information only a trained eye could interpret. The two aircraft were still following their assigned paths, but the distance between them was changing in a way Marcus could not ignore. He adjusted the settings, checked the altitude readings, and reviewed the flight data one more time. The numbers remained the same. He was not guessing. He was calculating. Marcus had always been that way. Even as a child growing up in Aurora, Colorado, he was the kind of person who noticed details others missed. His father, Elijah Carter, had worked for years as an aircraft maintenance technician at Denver International Airport. He used to bring Marcus near the observation areas and point toward the planes crossing the sky. Every aircraft has a story, his father would say. Every person inside deserves someone doing their job correctly. Those words stayed with Marcus. They followed him through training, through long nights studying aviation manuals, and through every difficult moment when he had to prove he belonged. Becoming an air traffic controller had never been easy. Marcus knew that some people judged him before they knew his abilities. Some saw his age before his experience. Some saw his appearance before his professionalism. But Marcus never allowed those assumptions to control his actions. The radar did not care about opinions. The radar only showed facts. "Marcus," a voice called from behind him. It was Jennifer Miller, one of the senior controllers working the afternoon shift. She looked at the screen, then at his expression. "You really think there is something wrong?" Marcus nodded slowly. "I think there is something developing. I want another set of eyes on it." Jennifer moved closer and studied the information. For a few seconds, she said nothing. Then her expression changed slightly. "The spacing is tighter than I expected." Marcus looked at her. "Exactly." Before Jennifer could respond, Richard Hayes returned to the station. His footsteps were calm, but his presence immediately changed the atmosphere around him. People respected Richard because he had spent decades making decisions in that room. He had seen weather emergencies, equipment failures, and countless complicated situations. To many employees, Richard represented experience itself, but Marcus noticed something else. Richard trusted what he already knew more than what he was seeing in front of him. "I heard you are still pushing this concern," Richard said. Marcus kept his voice professional. "I am requesting additional review." Richard looked around the room. "Everyone here understands the pressure of this job. We cannot create unnecessary distractions every time someone feels uncertain." Marcus felt the weight of those words, but he stayed focused. "This is not uncertainty. This is verification." Richard stared at him for a moment. "You are confident for someone who has not been here very long," Marcus answered quietly. "Confidence is not about how long someone has been sitting in a chair. It is about whether the information in front of them is accurate." The room became quieter. A few controllers continued working, but their attention shifted toward the conversation. Richard noticed the eyes watching them and lowered his voice. "Marcus, I need you to understand something. In this position, hesitation creates problems." Marcus looked back at the radar. "I agree. That is why I am speaking now." For a moment, the two men stood there surrounded by screens, voices, and the constant rhythm of aviation. One believed experience protected people from mistakes. The other believed listening prevented them. Then another alert appeared on the system. Marcus saw it immediately. His expression changed, not with fear, but with confirmation. The information was moving exactly as he predicted. He reached for his headset again. "I need authorization to continue the correction request." Richard watched him closely. "Marcus." The room waited. Marcus looked at the screen, knowing the next decision could define everything that happened after this moment. "Sir," he said calmly, "I would rather be remembered for speaking up too early than staying silent too long." Richard Hayes had spent more than 30 years learning how to control a room before he ever had to control the sky. In the Denver Air Route Traffic Control Center, his voice carried a certain authority. When he spoke, people usually listened. Not because he demanded attention, but because his experience had built a reputation that few people questioned. He had handled complicated situations, trained new controllers, and watched generations of employees come and go. To many people inside the facility, Richard was the person who knew what to do when others were unsure. But Marcus Carter was beginning to understand that experience could sometimes become a wall that stopped people from seeing something new. Richard looked at the radar display again, his eyes moving carefully across the information. The room around them continued operating, but the atmosphere had changed. Everyone could feel the tension between confidence and caution. "Marcus," Richard said, keeping his voice low, "I want you to step away from the assumption that something is wrong. Look at the entire situation, not just one possibility." Marcus turned slightly. "I have looked at the entire situation, sir. That is why I am concerned." Richard shook his head. "Concern is not the same as confirmation." Marcus remained calm. "No, sir, but concern is where confirmation begins." A few feet away, Jennifer Miller quietly watched the exchange. She had worked with Marcus long enough to know that he was not someone who reacted emotionally. He was not the type of person who raised his voice or searched for attention. If Marcus was speaking, it was because he had already studied the information carefully. "Richard," Jennifer said, "maybe we should run another simulation check." Richard glanced at her. "Jennifer, we do not change procedures because someone feels uncomfortable with the data." Marcus heard the words clearly. Someone feels uncomfortable. That was the phrase that bothered him. Because this was not about comfort. It was about responsibility. He remembered his first day entering the training program years earlier. He remembered sitting among people who had dreamed about aviation their entire lives. He remembered being one of the youngest people in the room and one of the few who looked different from everyone else. During training, one instructor had told him something he never forgot. The best controllers are not the ones who know everything. They are the ones humble enough to keep checking. Marcus carried that lesson with him every day. He checked. Then he checked again. Then he asked others to check with him. That was not weakness. That was discipline. Richard stepped closer to the console. "Marcus, you have a good record. I know you work hard. But sometimes, newer controllers mistake confidence for accuracy." Marcus looked directly at him. "And sometimes experienced people mistake familiarity for certainty." The sentence hung in the air. Nobody moved for a moment. Richard's expression tightened slightly. Not because Marcus had been disrespectful, but because the words challenged something deeper. The idea that experience alone could never guarantee perfection. The radar screen continued glowing. The aircraft signals continued moving. Time continued forward without waiting for anyone's pride or position. Marcus adjusted his headset again. "Flight 728. Confirm current heading." A few seconds passed. Then the pilot responded. "Control, Flight 728 confirming current heading." Marcus watched the data update. His concern remained. "Flight 442. Confirm altitude and heading." Another response came through. "Flight 442 confirming." The room became even quieter. The information was now clearer than before. Marcus looked at Richard. "Sir, we need to make adjustments now." Richard took a slow breath. He looked around the control center, at the screens, at the employees waiting for direction. The decision was no longer just between two people. It was a decision that would affect everyone watching. "You are certain?" Richard asked. Marcus did not hesitate. "Yes, sir." Richard studied him carefully. "And if you are wrong?" Marcus looked back at the radar. "Then I will accept responsibility." A pause followed. "But if I am right, we need to act before the situation gives us no options." Richard's face remained unreadable. He reached toward the communication system, but his hand stopped for a moment. The entire room waited. Then his expression changed. Not agreement, not yet. Something closer to doubt. Because for the first time, Richard Hayes was no longer questioning whether Marcus understood the system. He was questioning whether he had been too confident in himself. The room had reached a point where silence felt heavier than noise. The steady voices of controllers, the soft clicking of keyboards, and the constant movement of information across the screens all seemed to fade into the background as Richard Hayes stared at the radar. For years, Richard had built his career on making decisions quickly. He believed hesitation created uncertainty, and uncertainty created mistakes. But now he stood in front of a situation where the person asking for action was someone he had already started doubting. Marcus Carter remained at his station, calm and focused. He did not look angry. He did not look like someone trying to prove a point. He looked like someone carrying a responsibility too heavy to ignore. "Marcus," Richard finally said, "I need you to understand the seriousness of making unnecessary adjustments in controlled airspace." Marcus nodded. "I understand, sir." "Do you?" Richard replied. "Because once you make a decision, you cannot simply take it back." Marcus looked at the radar again. "That is exactly why I am making this decision now." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Jennifer Miller watched from her station, noticing something many others might have missed. Marcus was not challenging Richard's authority. He was challenging the idea that authority should replace evidence. Richard looked around the room. Several employees were quietly observing. He knew what was happening. Everyone was waiting to see which person would be proven right. And that was the part he disliked most, not the possibility of a mistake. The possibility that the mistake could come from refusing to listen. "Marcus, step aside for a moment," Richard said. Marcus looked surprised. "Sir, I want another controller to review the situation." Marcus took a breath. "I have no problem with another review." Richard paused. "Then, let it happen." Jennifer immediately began checking the information from another terminal. The seconds moved slowly. The radar continued its quiet rhythm. Marcus stood beside his station, watching the data change. And he knew the hardest moments were not always the ones filled with action. Sometimes the hardest moments were when you knew something was wrong, but the people around you were not ready to accept it. He remembered conversations from earlier in his career. The moments when people asked if he was ready. The moments when they questioned whether someone his age could handle the pressure. He had never answered those questions with arguments. He answered them by showing up prepared every day. Richard noticed Marcus standing quietly. "You are not going to defend yourself?" he asked. Marcus looked at him. "I already did." Richard frowned slightly. "When?" Marcus pointed toward the radar. "The information is my answer." For a brief moment, Richard had nothing to say. Then Jennifer spoke from her station. "Richard, I am seeing the same pattern." The room became still again. Richard walked toward her screen. "Show me." Jennifer pointed at the data. "The separation is decreasing faster than expected." Marcus caught it early. Richard studied the information carefully. His expression changed, but he quickly returned to his usual composure. "We still need confirmation." Marcus nodded. "Agreed." That answer seemed to surprise Richard. He expected Marcus to push harder. Instead, Marcus simply accepted the process. Because for him, this was never about being right. It was about preventing something from going wrong. The communication lines became busier. More voices entered the room. More eyes moved toward the same information Marcus had noticed minutes earlier. The concern that once belonged to one person was now shared by everyone. Richard looked back at Marcus. "Why did you keep pushing this?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "Because every person on those flights believes someone is paying attention." The sentence stayed with Richard. It was not dramatic. It was not a challenge. It was simply the reason Marcus had spoken up. Richard returned his attention to the radar. The decision ahead was becoming clearer, but accepting it meant admitting something difficult. The young controller he had questioned was not overreacting. He was doing exactly what he was trained to do. And now Richard had to decide whether he would protect his pride or protect the people depending on them. The atmosphere inside the Denver Air Route Traffic Control Center changed in a way nobody could ignore. Minutes earlier, Marcus Carter had been the only person raising a concern. Now, one by one, the same information he had been watching began appearing on every screen in the room. The quiet confidence of routine operations was replaced by focused attention. Controllers leaned forward. Headsets stayed pressed against ears. Every movement on the radar carried more meaning than before. Richard Hayes stood near Jennifer Miller's station, looking at the data without speaking. The room had become a place where every second mattered, and every decision had to be based on facts. "We need to verify the flight paths again," Richard said. His voice was controlled, but the certainty behind it was different now. Marcus noticed the change. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. Richard was no longer dismissing the concern. He was examining it. Jennifer continued reviewing the information. "The projected separation is continuing to decrease," she said. Marcus was right to flag this early. Those words landed quietly, but everyone heard them. Marcus did not react. He simply continued monitoring the system. He did not smile. He did not look toward Richard for approval. He knew this was not a moment for celebration. This was a moment for responsibility. Richard looked at Marcus. "You should have brought this directly to me before making repeated correction requests." Marcus turned toward him. "I did bring it to you, sir." The answer was respectful but honest. Richard paused. "And you continued after I told you to wait." Marcus nodded. Because the situation continued changing. The room became silent again. Richard studied him carefully. He expected defensiveness. He expected an argument. Instead, Marcus remained calm. "Sir, I understand the chain of command. I respect your position. But the people in those aircraft do not know our names. They do not know our titles. They only trust that someone is paying attention." Richard looked away for a moment. The sentence reached him in a way he did not expect. He had spent years teaching younger controllers that responsibility came before comfort. Yet now, he was being reminded of his own lesson. The communication system activated again. A pilot's voice came through clearly. "Denver Center, requesting confirmation of updated instructions." Marcus immediately prepared the response. Richard watched his hands move across the controls. There was no hesitation, no panic, just precision. "Flight 728, adjust heading 270, and maintain current altitude." The response came back. "Heading 270, confirmed." Another communication followed. "Flight 442, prepare for revised routing." The room waited. Then the confirmation arrived. The adjustment was beginning, but the tension did not disappear. Everyone knew the situation was not finished. The next few moments would determine whether the correction happened in time. Richard walked closer to Marcus's station. "How did you catch this?" he asked quietly. Marcus kept his eyes on the radar. "I noticed the pattern was unusual." Richard shook his head slightly. "Most people would have ignored it." Marcus answered, "That is why I did not." Richard looked at him. For the first time that day, he was not seeing a young employee who needed more experience. He was seeing a professional who had followed his training exactly. But before Richard could say anything else, another alert appeared. The tone was sharper. The screen changed. The room immediately focused. Jennifer looked up. "The system is confirming the conflict prediction." Nobody moved for a moment. Richard stared at the display. The possibility Marcus warned about was no longer theoretical. It was now visible to everyone. The same concern that had been questioned minutes earlier was now impossible to ignore. Marcus reached for his headset again. His voice remained steady. "Continue with the revised routing plan." Richard watched him closely. A decision had already been made. The question was no longer whether Marcus understood the situation. The question was whether everyone else would trust him before it was too late. Richard took a slow breath and looked across the control room. Then he gave the order that changed everything. "Follow Marcus's correction plan." For the first time since the conversation began, the entire room moved in the same direction. The entire control room seemed to hold its breath. The only sounds were the quiet movements of trained professionals doing everything they could to keep the situation under control. The radar screens continued glowing with lines and numbers, each one telling a story that only experienced eyes could understand. Marcus Carter remained at his station, his hands steady, his attention locked on the information in front of him. Around him, people who had once questioned his judgment were now following the plan he had warned about from the beginning. Richard Hayes stood nearby, watching every update carefully. For the first time in many years, he was not the person giving the answer. He was the person waiting to see if someone else had been right. The revised instructions were being processed. The aircraft were adjusting their routes. The system continued monitoring every change. Marcus listened carefully through his headset, waiting for confirmation from the pilot. "Thank you, Flight 728. Maintain current instructions and continue monitoring." A few seconds later, another confirmation arrived. The second aircraft was also following the updated routing. The tension in the room did not disappear immediately. Everyone knew that in aviation, relief came only after every detail was complete. But something had already changed. The person who had been told to wait, the person who had been questioned, was now the person everyone depended on. Jennifer Miller looked over at Marcus. "You stayed calm through all of that." Marcus kept watching the screen. "That is part of the job." She smiled slightly. Most people would have been trying to prove they were right. Marcus shook his head. Being right was never the goal. He paused. Making sure everyone got home was the goal. A few feet away, Richard heard those words. They stayed with him. For years, he had measured leadership by confidence, by quick decisions, by the ability to take control of a room. But watching Marcus now, he saw something different. Real responsibility did not always come with a loud voice. Sometimes it came from someone quietly asking others to look again. Richard walked closer to Marcus's station. The room noticed. Everyone noticed. "Marcus," Richard said. Marcus turned toward him. "Yes, sir." Richard looked at the radar screen, then back at Marcus. "How long were you watching this before you spoke up?" Marcus answered honestly. "About 3 minutes before I raised the concern. I wanted to make sure I was not missing anything." Richard nodded slowly. 3 minutes. That was the difference between a quick reaction and a careful decision. He looked around the control center. Every person there had witnessed the same thing. A younger controller had seen something unusual, trusted his training, and continued speaking even when his confidence was challenged. The room became quieter as the immediate pressure began to fade. The bright screen still reflected across the walls. The voices on the radio continued. The world outside continued moving. But inside that room, something had changed. Richard looked down for a moment. The weight of the situation was not about embarrassment. It was about understanding. He had spent years protecting standards. But today, he had almost allowed pride to stand between those standards and the person following them. "Marcus," Richard said quietly, "I owe you an explanation." Marcus waited. Richard continued, "I was focused on your experience level. I should have been focused on the information." Marcus did not interrupt. He simply listened. Richard took a breath. "You were doing your job." Those words were simple, but for Marcus, they carried meaning. Not because he needed approval, not because he wanted recognition, but because respect was built when people chose to see the person in front of them clearly. Marcus turned back toward the radar. The screens continued glowing in the same way they always had. The sky outside looked exactly the same as it had before. But inside the control center, the silence felt different. It was no longer the silence of doubt. It was the silence that came after people finally understood. The hours after the incident moved differently inside the Denver Air Route Traffic Control Center. The noise of routine operations had returned, but the feeling in the room was not the same. People continued watching screens, communicating with pilots, and managing the endless movement of aircraft across the country, yet everyone carried the memory of what had happened. A concern that began with one voice had become a lesson for everyone standing there. Marcus Carter remained focused at his station, continuing his responsibilities as if nothing unusual had happened. He answered calls, reviewed information, and monitored every detail with the same patience he had shown from the beginning. He did not look around for recognition. He did not wait for anyone to congratulate him. For Marcus, the important thing was that the passengers and crews were safe. That was enough. But for Richard Hayes, the moment was not so easy to move past. He returned to his office later that afternoon, closed the door, and sat quietly at his desk. The room was filled with decades of memories. Certificates lined the walls. Photos showed moments from his long career. Every achievement represented years of dedication. Yet as he looked around, one thought kept returning. He had almost ignored the person who was doing exactly what he had spent his career teaching others to do. Richard picked up the report from the operation review. He expected to find a mistake. Something small that would explain why Marcus had been so concerned. Instead, the report confirmed every step Marcus had taken. The timing, the calculations, the communication decisions, everything matched. Richard leaned back in his chair and stared at the pages in silence. For years, he had believed experience protected people from mistakes. But now he understood something more complicated. Experience was valuable, but only when it allowed someone to recognize the truth, even when the truth came from someone unexpected. Back in the control room, Marcus was finishing his shift when Jennifer walked over. "You know everyone is talking about what happened today," she said. Marcus smiled slightly. "That usually means I should check if I made a mistake." Jennifer shook her head. "No, this time they are talking because you did the right thing." Marcus looked toward the radar screens. "Doing the right thing should not be unusual." Jennifer paused. "Maybe not, but sometimes people need to be reminded." Marcus understood what she meant. He had spent years learning how to stay calm when others questioned him. He had learned that proving people wrong was not the same as proving himself. His goal was never to win an argument. His goal was to protect people who would never know his name. Later that evening, Richard returned to the control room. The bright screens reflected across the glass panels. The same place where he had once questioned Marcus was now the place where he needed to acknowledge the truth. Several employees noticed him walking toward Marcus's station. The room became slightly quieter. Richard stopped beside him. "Marcus." Marcus removed his headset. "Yes, sir?" Richard looked at the screen for a moment before speaking. "I reviewed the full report." Marcus waited. Richard continued. "Your assessment was accurate from the beginning." Marcus nodded. "Thank you, sir." Richard took a breath. "That is not all I wanted to say." The words surprised Marcus. Richard looked directly at him. "I focused too much on your years of experience and not enough on your ability. I let my assumptions influence my judgment." Nobody in the room moved. It was not common to hear Richard Hayes admit uncertainty. Marcus listened carefully. Richard continued. "A good leader should know when to listen. Today you reminded me of that." Marcus looked down briefly, then answered, "We all have the same responsibility, sir. The sky does not belong to any one person." Richard nodded slowly. Those words stayed with him, because they were simple, but they carried the truth he needed to understand. The next morning, Marcus walked into the control center the same way he always had. The same doors, the same lights, the same screens waiting for another day of decisions. But something had changed. The people around him no longer saw only a young controller. They saw a professional who had earned their trust. And Richard Hayes, a man who had spent decades believing he had all the answers, finally understood the importance of listening before judging. The morning light entered through the wide windows of the Denver Air Route Traffic Control Center, casting a soft glow across the control room. The same screens that had carried tension the day before were now filled with the familiar movement of aircraft across the country. The voices on the radios continued. The keyboards continued clicking. The work continued, but the atmosphere had changed. Marcus Carter noticed it the moment he walked through the doors. The small conversation stopped for a second, not because people were uncomfortable, but because they were recognizing him differently. For months, Marcus had been known as the young controller who worked hard and kept to himself. Now, his coworkers saw something else. They saw someone who had trusted his training when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Jennifer Miller approached him near his station. "You know, I have worked with a lot of controllers," she said. "Some people are confident because they want everyone to notice them. You were confident because you cared about what could happen." Marcus placed his headset on the desk and smiled. "I was just doing my job." Jennifer nodded. "That is exactly why people respect you." Marcus looked toward the radar screens. He appreciated the words, but he also knew the lesson was bigger than one person. A control center could only work when every person inside it was willing to listen. Later that morning, Richard Hayes called a meeting with the entire team. The room where he stood was the same room where Marcus had been questioned just days before. The same walls, the same tables, the same people watching. But Richard's approach was different. He stood quietly for a moment before speaking. "I want to address what happened during the last shift," he began. Everyone listened carefully. Richard was not someone who often spoke about mistakes. In this profession, we talk about procedures, accuracy, and responsibility. We talk about making the right decisions when pressure is high. He paused. But there is another responsibility we do not talk about enough. The responsibility to listen. Marcus stood near the back of the room watching. Richard continued. "A good team is not built by having one person with all the answers. It is built by people who trust each other enough to speak when something does not seem right." The room remained silent. Richard looked toward Marcus. Marcus Carter followed that principle. He saw something unusual. He reviewed the information, and he spoke up. Marcus lowered his eyes slightly. He was not looking for attention, but he understood the importance of the moment. This was not only an apology. It was an example being set for everyone else. After the meeting, Richard approached Marcus privately near the hallway outside the control room. The building was quieter there. The sounds of the operation continued behind the glass, but the moment felt separate from everything else. "Marcus," Richard said, "there is something I should have said earlier." Marcus turned toward him. Richard looked thoughtful. "I judged your experience before I considered your ability. That was unfair." Marcus listened without interrupting. Richard continued, "I have spent a long time teaching people that every detail matters. I should have remembered that includes every person too. Marcus nodded slowly. Thank you for saying that, sir. Richard looked surprised. You are not angry? Marcus thought for a moment. I was frustrated, but anger does not help us do the job better. Richard smiled faintly. That sounds like something an experienced person would say. Marcus smiled back. Maybe experience is not only measured by years. The two men stood there for a moment, both understanding that something important had changed between them. Richard had not lost authority by admitting he was wrong. He had gained something more valuable: trust. From that day forward, the training sessions at the center changed. New controllers were encouraged to ask questions, challenge information respectfully, and remember that every voice had value. Marcus continued working the same schedule, sitting at the same station, watching the same skies. He never forgot the moment when nobody believed him, but he also never forgot what happened after people finally chose to listen. Because sometimes the strongest change does not come from proving someone wrong. It comes from giving people the chance to see the truth. Several weeks had passed since the day the control room changed forever, but Marcus Carter still remembered the quiet moments more than anything else. He remembered the glow of the radar screens, the sound of the communication lines, and the feeling of standing alone with information he believed mattered. He never expected recognition. He never expected people to remember his name. He only remembered the responsibility attached to the seat in front of him. Every morning when Marcus walked into the Denver Air Route Traffic Control Center, he followed the same routine. He checked the systems. He reviewed the updates. He prepared himself for another day of decisions that affected people he would never meet. The work had not become easier. The responsibility had not become lighter. But something around him had changed. New controllers who once stayed quiet during training now asked more questions. Experienced employees, who once relied only on tradition, now looked at information from different perspectives. The biggest change was not in the equipment or the procedures. It was in the way people listened. Richard Hayes noticed that change too. The longtime operations manager had spent years believing leadership meant having the final answer. But after that day, he began to see leadership differently. It was not about always being the person who spoke first. It was about creating an environment where the right person could speak when it mattered. One afternoon, Richard walked through the control room and stopped beside Marcus's station. The room was busy, but calm. The screens displayed countless movements across the country. The familiar sounds of aviation filled the air. Richard watched Marcus work for a moment before speaking. "You know something, Marcus," he said. Marcus looked over. "What is that, sir?" Richard looked at the radar. "When I started in this field, I thought experience meant knowing what to do in every situation." Marcus listened carefully. Richard continued, "Now I think experience means knowing when you need to listen to someone else." Marcus gave a small smile. "That is a good lesson for everyone." Richard nodded. "Including me." The honesty in those words mattered. Not because Richard had lost his position, not because he needed to apologize forever, but because he had learned something that many people struggle to accept. Being respected does not require pretending to be perfect. True respect comes from being willing to grow. Later that year, Marcus was invited to speak with a group of new air traffic controller trainees. He stood in front of a room filled with people at the beginning of their careers. Some were young. Some had changed careers later in life. Each person carried a different story. Marcus looked at them and remembered his own first day. "This job will test your knowledge," he said. "It will test your focus. It will test your ability to stay calm when everyone else is waiting for answers." The room listened quietly. Marcus continued. "But the most important skill you can have is the courage to speak when something does not feel right, and the humility to listen when someone else speaks." After the session, one trainee approached him. "How do you stay confident when people doubt you?" the young man asked. Marcus thought about the question. He remembered every moment when he had been underestimated. He remembered every time he had to work harder to prove that he belonged. Then he answered, "You do not build confidence by convincing everyone else. You build it by knowing why you are there." The trainee nodded. Marcus looked through the window at the open sky above Colorado. The same sky that had carried thousands of aircraft during his career. The same sky that had taught him that every voice mattered. Years later, people would remember the day a young controller noticed something others missed. They would remember the moment a room full of experienced professionals learned the importance of listening. But Marcus would remember something simpler. A person does not need the loudest voice in the room to make a difference. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to speak, the patience to stay calm, and the humanity to care about people who may never know your name. The radar screens continued glowing. The aircraft continued moving. And inside the control center, a new understanding remained. The strongest voices are not always the ones with the most power. They are the ones brave enough to protect what matters.